the 9,842nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda of this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, African-led and development-focused counter-terrorism, strengthening African leadership and implementation of counter-terrorism initiatives. The agenda is adopted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. Foreign Minister, and the Algerian delegation for their leadership in convening this very important open debate today, and for Algeria's leadership role in countering terrorism in Africa under the leadership of President Tebboune. I would also like to thank Her Excellency, Madam Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, and other distinguished briefers, Commissioner Adeoye and Mr. Janet, for their valuable insights. We welcome the steps that have been taken by the African Union and African countries in their fight against terrorism. Mr. President, for the past 4 decades, Pakistan has been in the forefront of the fight against global terrorism. We have paid a heavy price, with over 80,000 casualties and enormous damage to our economy. After successfully suppressing Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups within our borders, Pakistan continues to confront terrorist groups like the TTP and Daesh, operating from safe havens across our borders. Mr. President, the global terrorism landscape has evolved dramatically since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1373. According to the Global Terrorism Index to 2024, the terrorism epicenter has now shifted from the Middle East to the Central Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa, which now accounts for more than 50% of all deaths from terrorism globally. Terrorist groups are operating with increasing impunity in ungoverned spaces, including in the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, Cabo Delgado, and with Burkina Faso and Mali among the 3 most affected countries. While Al-Qaeda core was decimated in Afghanistan, largely due to Pakistan's efforts, several of Al-Qaeda's subsidiaries have emerged elsewhere, including in North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Daesh was decimated in Syria and Iraq, but its franchises have emerged in Afghanistan and the Sahel. Let me just underline that nothing is Islamic about these groups. Terrorism has no religion, and it must not be projected as such. The most recent report of the monitoring team of the 1267 Al-Qaeda and Daesh Sanctions Committee details the vast nature of the global threat posed by these terrorist groups and their affiliates. Mr. President, we are all in this fight together. We must address the terrorist threat together through a comprehensive and coordinated strategy based upon the global counter-terrorism strategy. Mr. President, addressing the terrorist threat in Africa must be part of this comprehensive strategy. And in this regard, we would like to make a few points. One, a regional approach is pivotal for the establishment of effective security architecture for countering terrorism. In particular, regional cooperation and engagement is vital to address the issue of cross-border terrorism. The adoption of Resolution 2719 was a historic step towards providing predictable and sustainable support for AU-led peace support operations. Its effective implementation will enable African states to enforce peace and security on the African continent and give life to the quest for African solutions to African problems and the initiative of silencing the guns in Africa. We hope that the issues related to the implementation of this resolution will be resolved rapidly by the UN Security Council and by Africa's partners. To this end, the Council must agree expeditiously on the financing of the AU missions. Failure to reach consensus on financing has hindered the smooth transition of AU missions in several places and the implementation of strategies to counter entities like Al-Shabaab. Two, we should consider how AU-led enforcement missions can be assisted with relevant equipment, training, and supplementary UN counterparts to achieving their objectives. In our view, the UN's support will remain vital for the success of AU missions. Three, the AU and its sub-regional organizations should explore partnerships with other regional organizations such as the League of Arab States and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. We take note of the recently established AU, Arab League, and OIC trilateral mechanism. We also support the Nouakchott process and the Accra initiative and encourage ECOWAS and the Alliance of Sahel States to engage and explore pathways to counter-terrorism. Four, it is necessary to review the efficiency and impact of the Security Council's several sanctions regimes. Often, these have proved to be blunt instruments which contribute little to containing prevalent terrorist threats and often impede the socio-economic development of the countries concerned, which is so vital to ensure effective governance and security against terrorist threats. These sanctions regimes should be adapted to respond to the current challenges of the concerned African countries. Five, we are concerned about the use of new technologies by terrorist entities, in particular to organize online and collaborate with transnational criminal networks to recruit and finance their activities. We must address the new cyber tools of terrorism, including the dark web and cryptocurrencies, which are being utilized increasingly for radicalization campaigns, incitement to violence, terror financing, propaganda, and disinformation through the social media. Six, we must address the underlying reasons and root causes of terrorism in Africa. These include poverty, economic hardships, poor governance, small arms proliferation, presence of organized criminal gangs, illicit economies, drug trafficking, resource exploitation, and repeated external interventions. The promotion of Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063 in Africa, as has been said, are critical preconditions for defeating terrorism. Mr. President, Pakistan's support to the fight for stabilization in Africa dates back to the early 1990s. Our contingents have also participated for decades in peacekeeping missions in the DRC, Central African Republic, in Mali, in Sudan, in South Sudan. Pakistan desires to strengthen its cooperation with brotherly African states. Within the Security Council and in conjunction with the UN Office for Counter-Terrorism, Pakistan stands ready to share its counter-terrorism experience and expertise with our African partners and to help establish the necessary institutional structures and provide capacity building for Africa's endeavor to restore sustainable peace and stability on the continent. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the
President, Minister of Foreign Affairs, National Community Abroad, and African Affairs, Ahmed Attaf, for convening this discussion. We also thank Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, AU Commissioner Bankole Adeyoye, and Mr. Saeed Jinnit for their insights. The United States is deeply concerned by the increasing number and lethality of terrorist attacks in Africa. We urge the members of this council to take action and agree to listing more Africa-based ISIL and al-Qaeda affiliates in the 1267 Sanctions Committee, so they will be subject to a worldwide assets freeze. We also urge member states to support the designation of additional individuals in the Al-Shabaab Sanctions Committee. Terrorists only stand to benefit from the Council's inaction, particularly since money continues to be the lifeblood of terrorists. We should bolster our efforts to stem the flow of funds to terrorists and avoid politicizing sanctions listing proposals. The United States calls for action to address the growing relationship between the Houthis in Yemen and al-Shabaab and other malign actors in Somalia, as documented in reporting by the UN Sanctions Panel of Experts. The trade in arms and exchange of tactical and operational expertise between these groups will negatively impact security in Africa, the Middle East, and far beyond. We acknowledge the African Union's efforts to strengthen its counterterrorism architecture. When security efforts respect the rule of law and human rights, it builds trust in the police and military that is vital to undermining terrorist recruitment. Whereas, if a population suffers human rights violations at the hands of security services, and when governments fail to provide services, civilians may turn to violent extremists for protection, mediation of conflicts, and the provision of justice. It is also essential that members of civil society, particularly women and youth, meaningfully participate in the development and implementation of counterterrorism measures, given their unique understanding of the impact and risks of terrorism. They are able to help governments make counterterrorism efforts more effective. We must collectively do more to track terrorist recruitment in Africa and the movement of foreign terrorist fighter recruits within, to, and from the African continent. Moving forward, the United States understands that business as usual is a failing strategy to address the deep systemic challenges the African continent faces from terrorism. We look forward to the opportunity to work with willing African partners, the international community, and this Council to develop pragmatic solutions that will effectively counter the growing terrorist threat. I thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Excellency Minister, we'd like to thank Algeria for organizing this meeting on such an important issue. We're also grateful to all of the briefers. The security situation on the African continent remains complicated. We're witnessing a further increase in the activities of terrorist and criminal groups. Practically all of Africa's regions are under threat. At the same time, international terrorist organizations are actively radicalizing local populations, exploiting inter-ethnic and religious differences, socioeconomic problems, the weakness of state authority, planting their extremist ideologies. To fund themselves, terrorists are using the illicit extraction of minerals and the illicit trade in drugs, weapons, and people. This is the reason the nexus between terrorists and organized crime has been established. We're seeing the swift expansion of international terrorism, and this is something that began in Africa following the West's military aggression against Libya in 2011. Then, on the pretext of the responsibility to protect, Libyan statehood and its economy were shattered. These tragic events were fertile ground for the strengthening and spread of terrorist capacity on the continent. Today, Western states are holding forth about so-called conditions conducive to terrorism in Africa, hushing up the fact that high up on the list of such conditions are their own illicit actions and failures. President, the seriousness of the threats African states are confronting are hard to overestimate. Tensions persist in the northeast of Nigeria, following the activities of Boko Haram terrorists, as well as in Chad, the authorities of which are not only having to confront the terrorist threat, but also to address the issue of many refugees fleeing to Chad from neighboring Sudan, where a protracted military standoff continues. In the Horn of Africa, Al-Shabaab is undermining Somalia's statehood as well as regional stability. Al-Shabaab is relentlessly growing its capacity and influence, conducting regular forays, controlling vast swathes of territory in close proximity to the capital. Aside from this, Al-Shabaab is also using propaganda. It enjoys deep coffers, which are being replenished thanks to taxes levied in territories controlled by these insurgents and financed out of other illegal activities. The Somalian government is doing everything it can to counter the threats posed by these terrorist groups. The central government has on many occasions conducted large-scale offensive operations against the insurgents, as well as taken steps, targeted steps to combat Al-Shabaab activities, to fund itself and spread its ideology. An important contribution to containing this threat is being made by African peacekeepers. At the very end of 2024, the Security Council adopted a resolution replacing the AU transition mission in Somalia, ATMIS, by the AU support and stabilization mission in Somalia, AUSOM. Involved a clash between those who no longer want to fund African peacekeepers in Somalia and those who don't want to take on new financial obligations, not even through the AU-UN partnership mechanism. As a consequence, the issue of AUSOM funding in the first half of this year remains unresolved, despite statements made by traditional donors and partners of Somalia about support for Africans and their aspirations. Unfortunately, this is not the only example of the hypocrisy and double standards we're seeing. They're also evident in the Sahel, where Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and other states are combating international terrorism practically single-handedly. Former colonial capitals, on the pretext of combating terrorism, continue to impose their military presence in the region, a presence which has not been welcomed for some time by African countries, including because the ineffectiveness of these so-called counter-terrorism operations waged by Western states is obvious. On this note, we welcome the fact that Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have decided to bolster their own forces and to coordinate their efforts, including on counter-terrorism activities targeting Islamic State in the Greater Sahara and JNIM. The activities of these groups in the Leptako-Goma area and on the border of the Gulf of Guinea states are a particular cause for concern. A milestone in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel was the establishment by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in September of 2023, the Alliance of Sahel States, the ASS. One of the main objectives of the alliance is crafting a new security and mutual aid architecture in West Africa. A key objective of the alliance is jointly combating organized crime and terrorist organizations in the Sahel-Sahara region, as well as preventing and countering military and other threats to the territorial integrity and security of these three states. We welcome the decision to establish within the alliance of a joint force for coordinating efforts to combat terrorist groups. Alliance of Sahel States servicemen are already conducting joint raids on insurgent strongholds. Aside from collective measures, countries participating in the alliance are also taking individual measures to bolster the combat readiness of their own armed forces. Today, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are at the forefront of the fight against terrorist groups on the continent. They deserve our broad support, the support of the international community, and that of regional organizations as well. Despite this, there are still countries which are trying to undermine the progress that's been achieved so far, running unscrupulous campaigns aimed at spreading disinformation and tarnishing the reputation of local authorities. They're doing this through the media that they control. There are other states which are trying to undercut peace and security on the continent. This includes the Kiev regime. The official representative of the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Mr. Yusuf, as well as the ambassador of Ukraine to Senegal, Mr. Pivovarov, confirmed that the Kiev regime assisted the attack on the Malian armed forces on the border with Algeria near Tinzaouantine in July of 2024. Let me underscore that this attack was undertaken by a group linked to Al-Qaeda, an Al-Qaeda affiliate. A response from Sahel states was swift. They decisively condemned Ukraine's support for international terrorism on the continent and cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine as a result. According to Le Monde, a French publication, insurgents active in Mali were trained how to operate drones and handle explosives by Ukrainian secret services, both on Ukrainian and Malian territory in terrorist-controlled areas. This is another narrative which illustrates the terrorist nature of the Western-supported Kiev regime, a regime which is acting at the behest, under the supervision of, and in close coordination with its NATO backers. This regime is not above using outright terrorist methods. We'd also like to remind everyone about information from African states and European law enforcement, Europol. Information regarding weapons provided by Western states to Ukraine, which are now falling into the hands of terrorist and criminal groups in various regions. A thorough investigation and assessment of the role of Ukrainian and Western intelligence services in organizing and assisting terrorist attacks is long overdue. President, the Russian Federation relationships with countries in the region by mutual respect. We are closely attuned to the specific characteristics and needs of each and every state. We'd like to reassert our readiness to develop our cooperation with Africans using those formats and under those conditions which Africans deem optimal. We will continue making a constructive contribution to efforts aimed at achieving stability in the region, including by offering training by Russian instructors to servicemen and law enforcement bodies. We strive to broaden cooperation further, cooperation between Russia and African states, including by implementing a document adopted at the Second Russia-Africa Summit held in St. Petersburg in July 2023. This document was a declaration about strengthening cooperation in the fight against terrorism. At the first ministerial conference of the Russia-Africa Partnership Forum, held in Sochi in November of last year, of a joint statement about the implementation of the aforementioned declaration gave our relationship in this sphere an additional push. We attach particular importance to dedicated technical cooperation under the auspices of the UNOCT. Given that terrorists are trying to resuscitate ISIS 2.0 on the African continent, now more than ever it's important to bolster the capacity of states in the region and those of law enforcement as well, in addition to strengthening border security and combating terrorism financing. The Russian Federation has funded 2 key initiatives under OCT auspices in Africa, specifically the Global Program on promoting interagency cooperation on counter-terrorism and a project aimed to stop weapons, improvised explosive devices, and drones into terrorist hands. We welcome the positive and what's most important, the practical outcomes of the Office of Counterterrorism efforts on this front. In particular, as part of the first initiative I mentioned, 7 training manuals and a modular training course for analysts were established. Training courses were held for over 1,000 law enforcement officials. As part of the second initiative, the one related to weapons, 2 major regional events were held covering Western and Eastern Africa. This project should bolster the capacity of states in the region and deepen our knowledge about how to combat terrorists using weapons and IEDs, as well as explosive devices, to wage attacks. We're guided by the course adopted at the high-level African counterterrorism meeting held in Nigeria in April of 2024. We believe the outcomes of this meeting will help to build capacity on the continent. Last but not least, we are sending our best specialists as instructors to the OCT Training Center in Rabat. They're running courses for law enforcement officials from African countries, covering methods of countering terrorism financing and investigating terrorism crimes. We call on all states to pool their efforts to bolster the effectiveness and coordination of international cooperation in the fight against terrorism on the basis of principles and norms of international law, including those enshrined in the UN Charter, the principles of sovereign equality of states and non-interference in their internal affairs. I thank you.